And here we go, guys. Happy Friday, man. It's almost the weekend. Hope everybody's had a great week. Uh, Back with another installment of the I Hate Football podcast. I am your boy Q, and it's been a great sports week, man. Starting with draft prep. Really getting prepared for the draft coming up. On actually a week from yesterday. And that's starting to get going pretty good with rumors and people following mainly Shador is what it sounds like. But all that's kind of getting going. It was excuse me, it was Jackie Robinson Day earlier this week, and anybody not familiar with Jackie Robinson, probably our younger watchers, slash listeners, do some research on him. Not only a great baseball player, man, but just a great human being and somebody who contributed a lot, off the field. So anybody not familiar with him all the way, somebody really interesting and somebody you'd enjoy reading up on if you're not all the way familiar with him. What else is going on? We got the play-in tournament in the NBA that started. Really like what the NBA's done with that, man. Made it more interesting in my opinion. The early part of the playoffs, having that tournament, and I really think it's turned out really well. What else we got going on? We have the NHL playoffs are about to start. Actually started already last night. So a lot going on in the sports world. Hopefully, everybody got their taxes done. Hopefully, you got some good news, on on that end, better than me, hopefully. But what else got started this week was the NCAA transfer portal. The spring transfer window opened up, and really interesting development to start off with, and none more interesting, none more messy, none more, uh, you know, none more just, you know, off the wall when you hear more and more about all the happenings, surrounding Nico Iamaleava. And does anybody hate football more than Tennessee fans hate Nico right now, or Nico's dad, Big Nick? Because that situation turned messy, man. It really, really did. And again, the more details come out on that, it seems like the messier it gets, right? And it's it really is interesting because it's really easy to blame Nico during all this, right? And I think it's easy because when you really look at who he is and what he does, right? I haven't looked at any of his socials or anything like that, but I'm assuming he's a guy who's based on his age, based on what he does. I'd assume he's a guy who's has to be on social media, right? So I don't envy him, for what his socials must look like this week, because based on everything I've seen on Twitter slash X and everything like that, ESPN and the whole nine. There's a lot of bad press coming his way, and I would imagine what we all know about college students. They get pretty creative, in their hate and in their dislike of players, right? Especially football players. Again, everybody knows who they are. They're very accessible, based on social media and everything else. It's again, going back to an easy guy to dislike, based on who he is, right? I mean, he's face of a major SEC program, the University of Tennessee, right? A lot of exposure comes with that position, at quarterback and on Rocky Top, right? And everybody's been talking about what he makes, right? Everybody's been talking about his NIL deal and all this, essentially started over money, right? And I think he's one of those guys who I think when you talk about NIL, at least from what I can remember, he was one of the first real big NIL, uh, figures, right? When you talk about, I mean, his deal made huge news, right? A kid who had yet to step on a college campus signed a 3-year deal worth $8 million, and that's when really I got to know who he was. I'm not in California. I'm in Georgia, and as much as I follow high school recruiting and everything, he's a guy that wasn't really on my radar up until he signed that deal with Tennessee. I mean, that was huge news. And again, I think to that point, I don't remember ever seeing any deal, any NIL deal, that was that substantial, that was that big, so that thing made news, made headlines, and immediately he landed on everybody's radar, and so when you do that, again, you're going to get a lot of eyeballs on you, and a lot is going to be expected of you, right? And so he's a guy who's from Long Beach, California, right? Went all the way to Knoxville, Tennessee, and I don't pretend to know his family background or anything, but I can't imagine that there was he's Polynesian, from Long Beach, California. Can't imagine there was any real natural connection to Knoxville, Tennessee, that is literally on the other side of the country, right? You got to imagine you're 3,000-ish miles away, from home. No real connection there other than Tennessee is a program that does recruit nationally, but that was all money, right? I mean, let's call that what it is. That was he went to the highest bidder. And the more we find out about his family situation, mainly his dad, who everybody knows is Big Nick, kind of runs the show. I think it makes sense, that he essentially just went to the highest bidder, no matter how far that was from where he's from and where he was raised. So that's really how that played out. And so again, it's super easy to blame the guy, but when we look at truthfully, who is to blame, and I don't know how many people, and I'm sure people in Knoxville, Tennessee probably aren't gonna agree with me, but I think we can reasonably, right, when all the dust settles and everything, we're going to be able to agree that this really is the makings of the NCAA, right? And I think based on the way they've handled NIL, they've created this monster, and they've created this landscape that that we're currently dealing with in college athletics, and mainly football, and obviously you're starting to see it a lot with basketball, and those are the two sports really, that have made it, that NIL has made transferring really easy, right? Just pick up and go. I've seen people committing to schools, and you're looking at they've been at 3-4 schools, which is absolutely insane to me, right? Some of these guys that are like super seniors are like 24, 25. I've been in college for like 6 years, been at 4 or 5 different schools, and just again, something that I never thought I'd see personally. And but again, this is the fault of the NCAA and the way they've rolled out the NIL era. And you're looking at it, and I think, to me, one of the things, and I truthfully, I've talked to people, excuse me, and my opinion has always been that they're not. You got to remember, for a long time it was, hey, the NCAA needs to pay players, right? Players need to get paid. Players need to get paid. Players need to get paid. What the NCAA brings in always was brought up, billions of dollars, and off the backs of college student athletes and the whole deal. And let's not forget that there's still, the NCAA still isn't paying players, right? And then I think NIL, the way they've structured it, in my opinion, I think that's on purpose. I really, really do. Because you got to remember, they've made it so that now it's private citizens, collectives, companies, what have you, can pay players. And the what NIL was rolled out as was, essentially, you're making money, but it wasn't pay for play. There was, appearances, there was commercials, there was things that you had to do in order to get that money that entailed activity off the field. But they're not enforcing that. And I think we all know that. I think we all see that. It's essentially pay for play. And again, it's, in my opinion, it is by design. So again, who's to blame, right? It's a wild, wild west. And I'm sure everybody's heard that term, but and it gets overused a little bit. You're right when it comes to NCAA, current landscape of the NCAA in terms of NIL and everything like that, and being able to transfer, whenever essentially you want. But it really is. It's the wild, wild west. And I mean, there's very few rules. There's very few parameters, and you're looking at tampering on a massive scale, and there's really no way to enforce it, right? Because when we look at what the NCAA really has in terms of power, I think it starts with they don't have enough people to enforce all the rules and regulations that need to be enforced. You're looking at, I mean, I'm not sure how many people work for the NCAA, but I remember hearing a number a while back, but it's not many, right? When you're looking at just football, right? Let's not even talk about any other sports. You're talking about 134, I believe, FBS programs, made up of, roughly, 85 to 100 players, per team, somebody who's better than me can do that math. But you don't have enough people in the NCAA to enforce, all the rules and everything when it comes to NIL. That it's just it's not possible, right? And so when you're looking at what you've created, you've essentially allowed people, like these kids, and depending on where they're from, depending on how they were brought up, and who's around in terms of parents and brothers and uncles and the whole deal, but the handlers, right? And the people close to them, right? Whether it's 7-on-7 coaches, whether it's high school coaches, whether it's their high school football coach, uncles, fathers, in the case of Nico, it's his dad kind of running point on everything. But these are the people that are running, the NIL era right now. These are the guys that behind the scenes are making moves, that are tampering with everybody. There was reports of Dan Lanning, head coach of Oregon, calling Josh Heupel, who's the head coach at Tennessee, and telling him, "Hey, your boy's dad is sniffing around. He's looking for more money." Right. And so, it's good to see that, that still exists, and that Oregon, didn't go and kind of snipe, Nico from Tennessee, and read into that, whatever you want. But, the fact that that's going on, and listen, nobody's talking about, punishing anybody, right? Nobody's talking about, oh, there were rules broken or this and that. Why? Because essentially it's Nico's dad acting as his agent, contacting, head coaches, and and offering up his kid for the right amount of money, right? So how do you really enforce any rules when it comes to that, right? I mean, I don't know if there's anything in place for handlers, dads, coaches, whatever the case may be, essentially, shopping their kid, or their client, or whatever you want to call them, for more money. Again, the NCAA is just, they've created this mess, right? And so they selectively enforce. At best, they selectively enforce, right? And they have the programs that it seems like kind of tend to get the crap end of the stick. It's a family show, so I'm not gonna get into what I really want to say, right? But you can put two and two together, right? And I think we can all agree, that there's some programs that I think they tend to, kind of go out there harder. Being born and raised in Miami, it seems like, and I may be biased about it, right? But I can think of so many times right off the top of my head where, the NCAA holding, the University of Miami program hostage because they're investigating some BS allegation or claim, for a year and a half, just to come back with, oh, they didn't do anything wrong, or we're taking 2 scholarships over 2 years, right? And so, again, very selectively enforce, rules when when it comes to the NCAA. It just depends on who you are, and it seems like it just depend on the what day it is, what month it is, you know what moon cycle we're in, right? I mean, they just kind of pick and choose, what it is they want to enforce and when they want to enforce it. When they want to make an example out of somebody, and when they really want to go after, you know, whoever it is that they've heard something about. But again, we got to remember they have no subpoena power. They have no way of really enforcing a lot of the things that they say uh, that are rules, right? And so again, they just turned this thing into a mess, and we'll see moving forward if all this new revenue share and you know they're talking about a salary cap, and they're talking about ways to make the landscape of football, of college football, just instill some parity and have there be some fairness kind of across the board. So there isn't such a big disparity when you're talking about your top 12, 15 programs, if that, and the other 120 or so, right? I think it'd be, I'm sure your big programs, Ohio States and Georgia's and everything like that, Alabama's, probably want this thing to get delayed. But I would imagine that the majority of the programs, outside of, again, your top 12 to 15, are really looking forward to this thing getting enacted and becoming, law of the land, in order for them to compete. Because not every program has, an NIL collective at the strong as some of these big schools, right? When you're looking at all of a sudden Texas Tech, has a hell of a portal hall. They're, a lot of money over there in Lubbock, Texas, apparently. And they're paying all kind of people, I think they have the number one portal class, as of the winter portal window, excuse me. And you see them spending a bunch of money in basketball too. And so, not every school has those resources. Not every school has, those capabilities or those funds. And so, I think, again, when you're talking about your kind of lower tier schools in your P4 and group of five, I think they're probably pretty excited for this thing to really, become law and have a chance to even the playing field a little bit and be able to compete, with some of your bigger programs, right? So, we'll see how all that goes, but I think when you're talking about on the field and you're talking about Nico, really, really interesting move. Going back to what we're talking about in terms of his deal, here's a guy who, again, he was about to start, the third year of, an $8 million deal, and, when you're talking about his freshman season, he didn't really do anything. He was sitting behind, Joe Milton, and, he played the bowl game, and he got everybody excited because he had a hell of a game. And I can't remember the name of I can't remember which bowl they were in, but he played out of his mind, and got people really excited, for his his sophomore season, which is in 2024, his first full season of starting, and I mean had a good year, right? I mean he wasn't great, you got to remember, I mean, this kid was a 5-star recruit, kid who's 6'6", 215 probably, kid who's mobile, has a nice arm, but I think still has a way to go in terms of his, his development and his, really becoming a finished product at the quarterback position, right? And so, I mean, quarterback of a college football playoff team, which is is to be commended. But when you look at what Tennessee was this past season, I think anybody who watched them play and who's familiar with what type of team they had, they weren't a Nico-centric team, right? Nico was a guy who played, again, good, not great, but Tennessee was a running team, star running back, great O-line, right, with a great defense. You've got draft picks all over, both sides of that ball, and so, I think, again, he did an okay job his first season, right? Nobody's mad at it. when you're looking at, I think that the arrow was pointing up for him, right? And that's why, to me, the very interesting decision to transfer, really, like I said, to me, it caught me off guard, and I think, hearing different people's opinions and takes on it, some really interesting takes, in my opinion. But I think, again, anybody who thinks that this wasn't a money grab, or excuse me, an attempted money grab, is mistaken, right? I feel like, let's compare the numbers. Let's do that, right? So Joe Milton in 23, right? He was a draft pick, right? He ended up getting drafted. Patriots drafted him. He recently got traded to Dallas, which little head scratching to me why they would do that. But anyway, Joe Milton in 23, 2,813 yards, 20 touchdowns, 5 picks, 64.7% completion. And this was his 6th year in college football, right? He spent his first 3 years at Michigan, spent his last 3 years at Tennessee, right? Nico in 24, 2,616 yards, 19 touchdowns, 5 picks, 63.8 completion percentage. This was his 2nd year in college football, in his first year starting, right? So, again, several questions when you're looking at where he was in his development and what he had actually done in college to really justify his clamoring for more money, right? One full season, one okay season. I think he was something like 80th in QBR, in the country, right? And so, if you're Nico, this is the way that if I was Nico's dad, I feel like this is the way that I would look at the situation, right? You are going into your 3rd year in college, which, for those people who don't know, after year 3, you're eligible to enter the draft, right? That's their one rule, right? To enter the NFL draft, different than the NBA draft. In college football, you have to be out of high school for your graduating class has to be out of school for 3 years, right? So he was going to be draft eligible after the 25 season. And when you're looking at what that means, right? That's going to be, assuming he comes out, that was going to be the 26th draft will be the Arch Manning draft, right? And so when you're looking at it that perspective, you would assume that coming back to Tennessee under a coach like Josh Heupel, who is a highly thought of offensive mind, coming back to that offense for your 2nd full year starting would benefit you, right? It's a program who, is, I guess if you're a Tennessee fan, you're probably going to have, different views or whatever, but, than everybody else. But definitely one of the powers, right? Especially since Josh Heupel, got there. He replaced, I think he replaced Butch Jones, or he replaced Butch Jones. I might be wrong on that one, but they had a string of some bad coaches, right? And so, came in. I kind of questioned the hire, on the front end. I wasn't super sold on it. But he's turned out to be a great coach. He's recruiting really well, put together a really good team. They play defense, they run the ball, and so you would assume that coming back to that offense would be what you would want to do for continuity's sake, right? For good coaching sake, right? And so if you're looking at, again, going back to the draft, you're looking at him coming out in the 26th draft, and it's really Arch and everybody else, right? And so, to me, that would be where my aim would be, right? Is that 26th draft. And there are reports out there that Arch Manning is not sold on coming out in the draft. All right, take that however you want to take it. Maybe true, maybe not. I think he's making enough NIL money where, and he comes from money and, obviously a wealthy background, when you consider, the family dynamic, when a guy who doesn't necessarily have to come out, if he doesn't like, what the top of the draft looks like, right? Because again, listen, when that guy comes out, whether it's 26 or 27, he's going to be the first pick in the draft. I would bet decent money on that, right? And so, a guy who may not enter the draft, right? And so when you're looking at that and you're looking at the rest of the landscape in terms of draft eligible quarterbacks, I think you have to like where you sit if you're Nico, right? You really have to like your position, on people's draft boards at the quarterback position, right? So I think in my opinion, I think he took the small picture view, right? I think he was already in a good place when it came to money, right? And I guess it's easy for me to say. It's easy for me to say because I'm not being offered the money that these guys being offered is specifically Nico Iamaleava, right? So it's easy for me to sit here and say, well, he had enough money. But when you talk about his place in NIL across the country, I think he was at the top of the list, right? And I think I've heard a lot of people, and mistakenly so, in my opinion, a lot of people make the comparison to him and Carson Beck. Let me tell you something. Whether you're a Tennessee fan, a Nico fan, whatever it is, I'm here to tell you, Nico is not a better quarterback than Carson Beck. I'm telling you right now, Carson Beck on that Tennessee team, to me, they're in the running for a Final Four spot if Carson Beck is the quarterback of the Tennessee Volunteers last year with the weapons he would have had around him. The weapons that Nico had around him, the offensive line, that was a weakness at Georgia. The running game, which is a weakness at Georgia, right? With the weapons that Nico was surrounded by, if Carson Beck would have been surrounded by those same weapons, my guess would be Tennessee would have been possibly in the Final Four. So, again, these people, I've seen Cam Newton, Ryan Clark on ESPN, blaming Mario Cristobal for giving Carson Beck, whatever money they think they gave him. I'm here to tell you that figure that people are saying Carson Beck got is not correct. I have, a good friend of mine who's pretty well connected down there in Miami, and the figure that I heard was somewhere around 2.5, right? And so to me, I think what Nico and his family got caught up in was who knows, possibly Carson Beck, but honestly, I think to me, and something that people really aren't talking about was probably the quarterback who was at Tulane, who's now at Duke, Darian Mensah. And a lot of people, if you didn't really follow college football closely, you probably don't know who that is. But he's a kid who signed a 2-year, $8 million deal to go from Tulane to Duke, and I mean he signed it immediately as the winter portal window opened, and it kind of went really like lightly reported, and I was kind of surprised based on the deal that he got, and so I think it was less about Carson Beck, honestly, and I think it was more about Darian Mensah, getting $4 million a year from Duke, and him thinking, again, mistakenly thinking that Tennessee was going to pony up, that money, to give to him. So again, small picture view, in my personal opinion, that him and his family took, in these particular negotiations. They only had NIL in mind when he should have had NFL in mind, right? And to me, that a huge mistake. I think you were doing well, and I think you should have been thinking NFL and not NIL, at this point. And I think, a second year or a third year in the program, second year starting, and continuity at the, coaching / play caller position would have done him well for his draft prospects. So again, lost sight of that. I think when you're looking at, another thing he may have been looking at is listen, man, all these guys have transferred and all of them have done well, wherever they've gone. Right. And, you can look at a guy like Cam Ward, right, who elevated his stock, from a day 3 guy, more than likely, to the first pick in the draft, transferring from Washington State to Miami. Right. A guy like Kyle McCord, right, who, he was at Ohio State, riding the bench over there, went to Syracuse, had the most prolific passing offense, in the country. And now more than likely, I mean, he's going to get drafted. Right. And it's up where he's going to be drafted is up for debate. But I mean, he's a guy who's going to get drafted. A guy like Will Howard, left Kansas State, went to Ohio State. Obviously, I'm sure the NIL money was plenty more than what he was getting in Manhattan, Kansas, but transfers to Ohio State, elevates his draft stock and wins a national title and makes more money, in the meantime. All right. So, again, I'm sure there was, a lot of that, that he saw and maybe thought of replicating. But, I think it was different for him at Tennessee. I don't know that he was in the position that any of those three guys were, in their previous, situation. I think he was in a better situation. He was in a better program. Washington State, can't compete with Tennessee, right? A guy like Will Howard was at Kansas State, Washington State. None of those programs can compete with Tennessee. And then Kyle McCord was at Ohio State, but he wasn't starting, right? And so very different situations, I think, when you're comparing those three, to Nico. And there's other guys, right? But those are kind of the three, that I wanted to touch on that kind of came to mind. But when you're looking at this situation, man, just something that really just kind of went sideways. There's reports out there that, he was negotiating for more money during the college football playoff. Right. And again, people have transferred, people have asked for more money, but there's no reports of anybody else, trying to hold your team hostage during a college football playoff run. And I think that's what's different with a kid like Nico and with his dad, who again seems to be running point on everything. Just not the way to do things, right? I think there's a way to go about negotiating for more money, but it's not during a college football playoff run. That I think to me, you lose the locker room when you do that as a leader, and rightfully so. I don't think people are going to respect you if that's what you're doing. Waited till then fast forward, now to spring. Waited till the last practice of the spring. To basically sit out of practice because they weren't giving him more money, and then subsequently transferred, right after that. So, man, again, just a lot of shady, dealings, and now, he enters the draft, not the market that I would figure that he thought he was going to have. Right. And I think rightfully so. I think when you're looking at the way that happened, I think you have to be, really cautious, and you really, really have to do some serious, digging and inquiring, when you're looking at bringing in, a guy like Nico, especially at that position, right? It's different. If he was a defensive tackle, if it was a running back, a linebacker, a safety, whatever it is, it's different, right? You can chance some character issues at those positions. At the quarterback position, you can't chance character, right? You can't mortgage, those types of characteristics at the quarterback position. And so I think programs across the country looked at the way everything happened. They did some digging on their own and went, nah, I think we're going to pass, right? Because they're not passing on the talent. They're passing on all the off the field stuff, having to deal with his dad and that kind of thing, right? There was reports that essentially the only two programs that were really in on him were Tulane and UCLA. And then, news hits, that he landed at UCLA for like $1 million less, than what he was making at Tennessee. Right. And so is that really what we were looking for? Right. And then they were citing concerns about the offense and this and that. I'm not buying it. And to push back on what Cam Newton was saying on his podcast the other day, he was saying, well, it's not about money. It's bad advice. No, it was bad advice about money, right? Both things can be true. He got bad advice about money, right? He thought that he was in a position of power, and he wasn't. He had already been given a substantial amount of money, and they weren't looking to budge on that figure, right? And so, a lot of people are applauding it. I think if you're a coach, you're probably applauding it. If you're a player, not at Tennessee, But maybe a player, with his same sort of status and maybe the same position, you would have liked to have seen him get, a substantial raise, because maybe now you can start comparing things kind of like they do in the NFL, right? Well, I'm next up and I'm going to get, fill in the blank, dollar amount, right? And so, again, in my opinion, I think, it's a messy situation. I don't feel like he made the right decision. When you're looking at what UCLA did last year, 5-7, got some of the numbers right here. They were 47th in passing yards, which, again, not too much worse than Tennessee was last year, but 132nd in rushing at 86.6 yards, 126 in scoring at 18.4 points a game, 126 out of 134 teams. The 68 in defensive points against, they were 25.3, right? And so, again, not the talent that he's going to have that he had at Tennessee, right? He's not going to have that at UCLA. They don't recruit the same. I can't imagine there's the same amount of money being pumped into the program. Just again, the only benefit is he's closer to home, right? But I don't know that he won in this situation, and I think when we're looking at everything that happened and the way it happened, I think it's that there should be really a cautionary tale, right, to players, to handlers, to everything like that, and to teams as well, right? You need to make sure that who you're bringing in. You need to do homework, on who you're bringing in and what they believe in and what they're about. And again, just another reason for the NCAA to really step up and and put in some rules and some parameters and some guidelines to avoid this stuff from happening again, because again, it really is a messy situation. And I think honestly, he ended up losing in this particular situation. Hopefully it works out for him. Hopefully it works out for UCLA. Hopefully it works out for Tennessee. But I think, if I'm being honest and I'm putting money on it working, one way or the other, I think Tennessee in time will be fine. I don't know who they have on the depth chart behind Nico, but I don't think Nico's going to be surrounded by enough talent in UCLA to make this move really worth it. Especially after taking a pay cut to move back to California, who we all know has the highest taxes in the country. Good luck with that, man. Again, hopefully it works out for you. You're closer to home. But again, NCAA, step up. Put in some rules, and let's keep this from happening moving forward. All right, guys. So happy to be with you tonight or today. And I hope everybody has a great weekend. And thanks for listening. Do me a huge favor, like and subscribe. All right. Super easy to do so. And it'll definitely help me out. Okay. So until next time, guys, talk to you soon.